Before I start on the lecture, I want to just give you guys a little bit of an idea about what the society has been doing. You know, as a nonprofit, technically with the IRS every year we're supposed to give a report to the members about what we do. We haven't done that in a long time. So I wanted to do a twofer, both a little thing up here and also in the latest glyphs. There's a 3-page essay about all the neat stuff that society's been doing this past year. So to begin, back in June, just before I came on the board, or became president, we had our 100th anniversary picnic, which was a great way to start the year. I don't know, at least 100 people showed up. Here's Jesse cutting our wonderful cake. Here's Jill's and my dog Lucy, and the wonderful piñata that Mary and Alan saved. But I want to say thank you to 3 of our outgoing board members. Michael Boley has been on the board for 9 years. He's been both a member at large as well as our recording secretary for a number of years. And then also Mary Presiunas, stepping down after 2 terms, and Steve Swanson. And Steve actually lives in Phoenix, but he Skyped into almost all the meetings and was super active when we did a variety of activities during the year in places other than Tucson. And so I really want to say thank you to all of them. And I also want to welcome, we have 4 new board members. The election cycle is over. Everyone on the ballot won. I know that's hard to believe. But I really want to say thank you to these 4 new board members. They're going to really complement the skill sets that we already have, and they're really going to do a terrific job. So just a super brief overview about some of the standing committees. You know, our organization is run by a board of directors and a number of standing ad hoc committees, entirely volunteer organization. And the number one thing that we do as a society is to support the Arizona State Museum. So, you know, through book sales and things like that during the course of the year, a lot of emeritus faculty, when they've retired, have donated their gargantuan libraries to Archaeology, and we've gone on to sell them. And we've raised over $6,000 for the library fund for ASM. And they have a 0 budget, so every dollar that we give them is exactly what their budget is for acquisition of books. The Research Grant Committee, another extremely powerful committee. We had the inaugural Carol B. Martin Award this past year. You know, Carol B. Martin passed away, left us $25,000. She was an avocationalist, and so we wanted to do something with that money. So over the course of the next 5 years, we're going to be giving away $5,000. It was a great competition. We had over 10 people apply, all very strong. And Aaron Wright from Archaeology Southwest received the grant. And we also were able to award $8,500 in research and travel grants to 15 grantees from 11 different institutions. So to me, that's pretty impressive. Our field trip committee that Catherine is the chair of, we did 13 field trips this year, all around the state, not just in Tucson. And all the lectures that we do every month, we have an average of 75 folks coming to them. The publications committee, they do so much. The Hayden Student Paper Prize with the AAC, that was awarded recently to Christina Whitney from New Mexico State. We continue with our publications subvention program. Pat Gilman here in the audience, she and Steve LeBlanc received that this year for a publication that's going to be published through University of Arizona Press. Pat said it's in press right now, so it's very close. And then Glyphs and Kiva continue to be super popular. And I'm really excited about this next little thing. I contacted JSTOR, who is the host for hosting all of our back issues of Kiva. And in 2016, over 25,000 articles were accessed that were Kiva. So that really says a lot. So here's just a graphic. About 19,000 of those over 25,000 were accessed here in the United States. Then a total of 23,000 were in these countries here. I think that's about 10 or 11 countries. And this is all the countries in the world that accessed Kiva last year. So, thought that was pretty cool. The awards committee. I see Jeff Ulchel in the audience. He was one of the Victor R. Stoner Award recipients this past year, along with Al Dart, and then Karen Adams and Tom Sheridan both received the Brian Cummings Awards. And we also we're going to be awarding at Pecos this year the brand new Alexander J. Lindsay Jr. Unsung Heroes Award. And so Rich is responsible. He came to the board and presented that to us, and I just think it's a terrific award. So I'm really excited. The board just voted on those grantees, and it's a big secret until Pecos. So, the finance committee. Jeff Clark's been the chair of that for many years, and Jeff and the committee track our investments for our different endowment funds, and our endowment funds now total over $500,000. So that's pretty incredible. And we pull up to 4% of that every year, and it supports a wide variety of programs that we have. So I think we're ready for the next 100 years. So thanks. Okay. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about creating community in Colonial, Alta, California. It's something that I've been interested in. I've been doing colonial stuff in California for about 13, 14 years. And I've been thinking about communities for a while now. I actually started thinking about them here in the American Southwest with some Anasazi sites, looking at the transition from pit house to kivas to great kivas at a major job that statistical research did a few years ago. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was thinking about this transformation and this big increase in creating community, but we weren't really able to identify who were the actual individuals in the community. And so with some of this research that we're doing now in California, we're actually able to identify a bit better who some of those actual people are. So there's really two different groups that help me think about this. Oh, okay. All right. On the left is one of our volumes from the Playa Vista Archaeological and Historical Project, which is over a 25-year project in West Los Angeles, for which some of the data for this talk came from. And then on the right, Kathleen Hull on the right-hand side there in the photograph, she and I are editing a book looking at the creation of communities in Alta, California. And this group are the senior authors for the different chapters that are in that book. And so, well, it's, oh, okay. So these folks all were really helpful in helping me and the rest of us really think about the creation of communities and what that actually means. And this was held at actually San Antonio de Padua, one of the California missions that's been turned into a conference center. So it was very appropriate to meet there. So when we think about Los Angeles today, this is kind of what we think about, right? The left-hand side is actually the Playa Vista project area. It's West Los Angeles. That's Marina del Rey in the background there. But you know, traffic, I mean, I was in LA a few months ago. I had breakfast with my folks and I had to drive to Pasadena, which with no traffic is about 25 minutes. And it took me an hour and 45 minutes to get where I was going because it was a long time of day. And it's so easy to just think about that's Los Angeles and there's nothing left from the past. But that's really not the way to think about it. You know, when you think about exits off the freeway and you think about names like Cucamonga or Azusa or Topanga or Malibu or all of these other places, those are actually Native American names. And there's that heritage right there. So tonight, instead of thinking about this, I want you to think about this time in Los Angeles' history. This is a picture, or a drawing of the Pueblo of Los Angeles back in probably the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the ranchos and everything else. So, but just to give you a little bit of background in terms of how the Spanish got to California. This is Mesoamerica and Central America and Mexico. And in 1519, Cortez showed up in Mexico. Within a short amount of time, it made a lot of alliances, conquered the Aztecs, made alliances with a lot of Nahua. And within 10 years, they started heading south into what's now Guatemala. And the Nahua warriors that traveled along with the Spanish actually documented from their own perspective those travels. And this is called the lienzo. It's a drawing from 1530 of the second campaign into Guatemala, with the Spanish leading and showing a variety of scenes. You know, this is another depiction of that same lienzo of major battles. The Guatemalans did not embrace the Spanish arriving. And so then also during that same time period, very quickly after Cortez showed up, they started heading north. And the Coronado expedition in 1540 went all the way to Kansas, went through New Mexico. And this is just a map of showing Arizona and New Mexico and some of the approximate, this isn't exact drawings of course, but approximate routes of a lot of the different campaigns into New Mexico and Arizona, 1500s, 1600s. But really here in southern Arizona, it wasn't until the very late 1600s and 1700s when missions started to become established. And as many of you know, Tucson wasn't established until the 1770s with the Presidio. And so heading to California took a very long time. You know, the Spanish were conquering New Mexico and Guatemala in the early to mid 1500s. They weren't showing up in California until the relatively late 1700s. So by then they really had it fine-tuned, their colonial campaigns. And it was also very different. There weren't, you know, when the Alvarado brothers went to Guatemala, they had 8,000 to 10,000 Central Mexican warriors with them and just a few hundred Spaniards. So it was a real military campaign. Most of the expeditions to California were literally just colonists. Everyday people from Sinaloa, from Sonora, that were just trying to scrape out a better life for themselves. Getting away from the heartland of Mexico with what Bart Voss has called a pigmentocracy, where the darker skinned you were, the harder chance you had to scrape by, because you were so much lower in the caste system. And so literally with the Anza expedition, leaving Tubac, just south of here, in 1775, those colonists were issued clothing that in the central heart of Mexico, they never would have been allowed to have worn. So from the very beginning of the Anza expedition and folks going to California, they were creating new identities in the frontier, away from the motherland. So as you can see, this is the Anza expedition route and some of the locations along the way. By that point, once the Anza expedition went through California, San Diego, Presidio, and Mission had already been established and so forth. But this is the area down here where I'm going to be speaking of today, Southern California, around the Pueblo of Los Angeles. And this is a reconstruction of the approximate location of a number of the Native American villages that were in the greater Los Angeles area at that time. This comes out of work from King and from John Johnson and Steve Norris, one of our GIS experts in statistical research, worked with me on creating this, georeferencing a number of different maps, overlaying and so forth. And so we'll never know the exact location, but I think in many cases these are probably pretty good based on a number of different factors. So when the Spanish showed up, this is Luke Weisner, who works for statistical research, worked with us on creating this incredibly beautiful depiction of what life might have been like on the west side of LA. on the Bayona Lagoon. And during that time, before the Spanish showed up, you're talking about hunter-gatherers, you're talking about people moving around to different areas across the Los Angeles basin at different times of the year, spending part of the year at the ocean, maybe going into the uplands in the fall to collect acorns, walnuts, and so forth, a seasonal round. They did a lot of hunting, a lot of gathering, but once the Spanish showed up, things really changed. The Spanish started building missions, started recruiting Native Americans, and unlike some other places, like here in southern Arizona, where they might set up a mission and Native Americans are free to come and spend time and then go back to their home village, here in Southern California, they had a different model called reducción, literally reduction, where you're recruiting people, Native Americans, from their villages, they're abandoning their villages, moving to the missions. And there's a number of reasons why that might have occurred. Ken Lightfoot talks a lot about how these padres were excellent salesmen, and I think that's very true. But at the same time, there's a lot of good evidence suggesting that within a very short amount of time, less than a lifespan, after the missions were set up, you had hundreds of thousands of sheep, of goat, of horses, of cattle, destroying the natural landscape and all of the hunting and gathering locations that these Native Americans had used for thousands of years. And so most likely one of the big draws was also hunger. So, and in addition to the missions, there were also the ranchos. And these ranchos were set up in the exact locations, of course, where Native American villages were. They would encompass them. And in some cases, those Native Americans stayed and worked on the ranchos or tried to elk out a life of refuge away from the missions and possibly away from the direct incursion of the ranchos. But through time, through generations, that was more and more difficult. And so through time, if these villages stayed on the ranchos, most likely they would get incorporated into that economy. But as you might guess, there was a big friction between the ranchos and the missions. And this is just a quote from one of the fathers who traveled through Southern California in 1795, and once he got to Mission San Gabriel, wrote down lamenting how these Native Americans wanted nothing to do with the missions, and that the ranchos were somehow hiding them, keeping them away from the missions, and that they were transforming into a variety of different types of jobs at the missions themselves, or I'm sorry, at the ranchos themselves. But that doesn't mean that these Native Americans lost their identity as Native Americans. They may have dressed differently, they may have acted differently, but as we'll see tonight, a lot of things actually remain the same. So on the ranchos, one of the ways that they were able to pay these Native Americans to work was through giving them a wide variety of gifts, or a wide variety of items that were brought in on these, either overland or by ship from San Blas, Mexico. Glass beads, copper chocolate pots, a wide variety of clothing, a variety of other stuff. A ranchero named Nieto, who was along Alameda Corridor, talked about how he would trade virtually anything with the Native Americans. If a Native American worked in the fields growing corn for a colonist, they would receive between a third and a half of the crops at the end of that cycle. So, they did receive a wide variety of things. But tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about the creation of community, and that's all the background of what we're going to be talking about tonight. One of the things as archaeologists that's so easy to do is take a look at a number of sites on the landscape and draw a big circle around it and say, oh, well, that was a community, because they're spatially close to one another. Clearly, they're interacting with each other. But I think the community is a lot more than that. And that's something that Jim Potter, Mark Varian, and a number of other archaeological scholars, when they've been writing about community, have brought that up very distinctly. And what's really important, I think, are social relations. for the creation of community. And it's this notion of a sense of belonging. Members place importance on it and also receive importance and meaning from that. And community isn't something that's homogeneous. There's this concept of a natural community, of face-to-face interaction every day. Everybody's getting along, it's utopia. And we all know from our own personal relationships that that's not the way it is. Everybody's coming at things from a slightly different angle. There may be socioeconomic differences, there may be religious differences. It's a very heterogeneous thing, but people are coming together for a certain purpose. And something that's also related to it, it's kind of just the opposite of natural community, is this concept of imagined community, where you may have people in your lives that you interact with daily or weekly that live close to you, that you may consider it a community. But you also have people in your lives that are very far flung, that you may only get together with once a year or intermittently, but they're still part of your peeps, right? They're still part of your community. And so that's where this concept of imagined community comes from. And during the mission period, those interactions are very fluid because life is very fluid. Every year for Native Americans during the mission period, there were massive amounts of change going on. And so those relationships are going to change. And so you tend to be reimagining and recreating your communities time and time again. But how does this relate to Native Californians or Native Americans and colonists? And so for the first part of this talk tonight, I'm just going to give 3 very brief examples of some of the interactions. And these are all based on ethnohistoric documents, on archival documents, not so much based on archaeology. We're able to look at, through mission records from, say, Mission San Gabriel, or the Pueblo of Los Angeles, or Mission San Fernando, we're able to look at baptismal records, godparent records, witnesses to baptisms, and so forth, to really try to understand what's going on. And it's important to point out, when we talk about baptisms, most people think of baptisms only occurring at a church. And during the mission period in California, that was generally true. Native Americans they were called Gentiles before they were baptized, then they were called neophytes afterwards. Most Native Americans were baptized either at the mission or the Pueblo church in the Los Angeles area. But of the roughly 5,000 Native Americans that got baptized, about 4% of them were actually baptized in the hinterlands. They were baptized on these ranchos by lay people. And in the Catholic Church, the only time that a lay person can baptize is in danger of death. And so I studied, for these 3 different case studies, I looked at the relationships between Native Americans and colonists based on these different types of interactions based on baptism. And so the first family here, this is up in the upper left corner where the circle is Rancho Simi. And anybody who's ever driven from Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, on the Ventura Freeway is driven right through the heart of Rancho Simi in the Simi Valley. So Santiago and his 2 sons, Francisco Javier and Patricio, were granted Rancho Simi in 1795. No, I'm sorry, 1795. And they conducted a total of 17 baptisms over the years, primarily on the rancho of Native Americans in danger of death. Santiago was a retired soldier from San Diego Presidio and was originally from Sinaloa, Mexico, as were most of the early colonists. And so Patricio, Santiago's son, baptized a total of 13 Native Americans between approximately 1802 and 1818, all apparently right in the surrounding area of Rancho Simi. And it's kind of incredible to me. Santiago and Patricio were godparents to a total of 49 Native Americans. So you're really talking, and it wasn't just, they were also witnesses to baptisms at the Pueblo, so they would follow some of these Native Americans who worked on the rancho all the way to the Pueblo or the mission to follow up on these important parts of life for them. They were clearly very pious people. So a second example is the Rancho Las Virgenes, also called Rancho Talapap. And it's just south of the Ventura Freeway when you're driving towards Santa Barbara. It's up in the Santa Monica Mountains. And Miguel Ortega was a pretty interesting individual. He was actually from Puebla, Mexico originally. It was actually of Nahua ancestry, so he was actually indigenous Mexican. And he, very interestingly, baptized two Native Americans at Malibu, Umalibu, which is what we call Malibu. And one of those was the dying infant daughter of the chief, or the Capitan of Malibu, of Umalibu. And Ortega's first wife was named Maria Rosa, and she was a converted Native American, a Chumash from Mission Santa Buenaventura. And he and his wife were godparents to a number of different Chumash, likely from around their rancho. And after his first wife died, Miguel Ortega married another Native American, also Chumash, from the village of Umalibu. So clearly there's this very strong connection that he had with this one particular village that was near his rancho. And I believe strongly that Native Americans from Umalibu were working on his rancho. The burial ground in Umalibu, which was excavated back in the 70s, had a wide variety of artifacts associated with rancho activity, being cowboys, of massive amounts of glass beads, a variety of other sorts of Hispanic items that would have been given in trade for labor. And when you look at Umalibu baptisms, you'll see early on there's some little smattering of people, but as soon as the two ranches in the area around Umalibu were established, within just a couple of years, Umalibu took a huge nosedive. And actually in 1805, there's 52 people that were baptized. They were all baptized in one day. And the first person in that registry was the Capitan. So the chief of Umalibu led all of his villagers at Mission San Fernando to be baptized. And so I think that this really says something too about this push and pull. The missions are complaining that Native Americans are staying in ranchos and aren't being brought into the fold, the religious fold. But it's very clear that once ranchos are established, there's massive amounts of interaction between these rancheros and Native Americans, and they are creating community, and they are being brought into the fold and being baptized. But it's also leading to the decline of those Native American communities as a physical place on the landscape. And most likely, at that point, those that are left and aren't living at the missions are being incorporated into the rancho economy. And so this final example of these three is the Rancho Los Quintos. And it was around for a very short period of time, 1804 to 1809. You'll hear more about the archaeology of it in just a minute. But the Quinto Zuniga family was actually another really interesting family. Pio Quinto Zuniga, the patriarch of the family who established the rancho, he was half Native American from Sonora, Mexico. He'd been a soldier at San Juan Capistrano where he met his neophyte wife, Rufina. They then moved to West Los Angeles, had a number of children, and baptized several Native Americans from the village of Guaspet, which was within their rancho, and were also the godparents to several other members from Guaspet as well. And actually, Pio Quinto Zuniga, he actually was at the Pueblo of Los Angeles at one point and baptized in danger of death a Native American from Guaspet who was at Yabit, which is at the Pueblo of Los Angeles, which is right across the river, is a Native American community. So in all three of these cases, you see, I think, a pretty strong interaction between Native Americans and colonists. Native Americans are likely working on those ranchos. Clearly, the rancheros are very pious. And in 2 out of these 3 cases, it's actually a pretty rare occurrence. You see a colonist marrying a Native American and creating a much stronger bond with Native Americans because of that, partially because the wife of that couple is going to speak the local language and the colonist may not. Their children are going to be at least half Native American as well. And so you're really creating these strong bonds. Right, so I should have moved this up, but that summarizes some of the stuff I just said. And so again, there's actually 2 villages associated with Rancho Los Quintos. One's called Comicrabet, which was somewhere around Santa Monica, and Guaspet, which is right around Playa del Rey. And again, just like in the last figure, this in 1803 is right around the time Rancho Los Quintos was formed, and you immediately start to see right around that same time period a massive spike in baptisms. People are being recruited to the missions. And in some cases, folks may be being baptized and actually going back. We know from baptismal records of 2 individuals who were baptized in danger of death at Guaspet by the rancheros, and they were buried that same day at Guaspet. So there are these very strong relationships. And so thus far, these are some of the high points. Some of the stuff I was just saying, the rancheros and Native Americans really did have a close relationship. And it's true that I think in some cases, the rancheros were trying to hold on to as much labor in terms of Native American labor as they could. But at the same time, these are extremely pious people. And so they're doing everything they can to save lives in terms of spirituality. And that probably meant 2 entirely different things to Chumash or Gabrielino Native Americans as it did for these colonists. But I think it did resonate at some level. And again, once these ranchos are established within a very short amount of time, I think that's really starting to show the decline of native life in those areas. And there's a radical transformation. But again, it's not that Native Americans are stopped being Native American. Their identity hasn't changed. It's just that they're doing different activities. So the next part I want to talk about in terms of communities is talking more about the archaeology. We talk, and I'll relate it to ethnohistory as well. But something that's very important in Gabrielino, or the folks, Native Americans from around the Los Angeles area, Gabrielino and Tongva, in the past was something called the mourning ceremony. And it was an annual or a semi-annual rite where Native Americans from a very large area would come together to remember their ancestors, remember those that have recently departed. They may bring some of their ancestors' items and purposely break them. They may make perishable effigies that they may burn. There's a wide variety of ritual destroying of items of these folks that have recently passed as a way of remembering them. And these mourning ceremonies did a wide variety of things besides remember their ancestors. You're bringing people together, you're performing ritual in a certain way to translate and get across different ideas to help create community. And so these are some of the sites in the greater Los Angeles area where we've archaeologically found in the past these mourning ceremony sites. And I'll show you some examples. One of the sites in the Bayona area around Guaspet that I helped lead the excavations for about 15 years ago is called West Bluffs, a site called LAN 63. And right smack in the middle of this very large site, we found this extremely large, the core of it's roughly 2 meters by 3 meters, and it may have been over 5 meters across, of just massive, massive amounts of these purposefully broken groundstone. There was whale bone in there. Sometimes you would actually find some cremated human bone. And this groundstone is made out of a wide variety of different types of either utilitarian or non-utilitarian items. Clearly, some of these artifacts were being made specifically for ritual destruction. And on the right, this is just close-up. You can see some steatite and a variety of other things, an abalone shell. Unfortunately, this site was so churned up with rodents that our macrobot really didn't give us a whole lot of insight into the plant remains that may have been burned here as well or placed here. Here's, pardon me, on the left, another close-up of a portion of this morning ceremony feature, and here's a plan view drawing to give you a broad sense of the core of this feature in the wider area. And so this is the remains of folks likely on a, an annual basis or semi-annual coming together, creating not in a familial way, but in a community way, ritual activity that's bringing people together, communicating different sorts of things through performance, and really reinforcing strong bonds between each other and the ritual language and purpose. There was another site, and so that dates to about 2,000 years ago. Here's another site from along Alameda Bay in Orange County that was dug by a company called EDA, back actually right around the same time period, back in the early 2000s. It's another example of one of these morning ceremony features. This one had massive amounts of cremated human bone in it. And on the right-hand side, here's just an example to give you a sense of the scale of it. Lots of purposely broken artifacts that were clearly reconstructed. Kathleen Hull, one of my colleagues, analyzed from West Bluffs all the lithics and found a very clear pattern of breakage, of placing ochre on top of these things, spittling it with asphaltum, which is like tar, in a very, a very particular manner. And we find that 2,000 years later during the mission period as well, these same exact patterns. And this actually here on the right is from West Bluffs. This pestle right here, some people have thought might actually represent a whale baculum or a penis bone. And this thing is made out of sandstone. It was clearly never made to be used for actually grinding or using as a pestle. And it was about 2 meters long. So it's about 6 feet long. It's incredibly big. And it was found buried in one of these features at West Bluffs in a ritual way. And you could actually understand the actual sequence of breakage and so forth based on the way it was analyzed. So moving forward from 2,000 years ago to the mission period, the morning ceremony was still alive and well during the mission period. And missions themselves, Native Americans, even though they may have been baptized and were neophytes and were highly entrenched in the missions, at the same time, these Native Americans performed Native ceremonies at the missions. And actually in 1785, there was a decree placed on all missions in Southern California disallowing dancing. And this actually is likely, according to Steve Hackle, one of the reasons that led to one of the revolts at Mission San Gabriel was this disallowing of traditional ritual. And I think for many Native Americans, like I was saying before, being baptized clearly for many of them didn't resonate the same way that it would with someone who, was a colonist. And I think that they, in many cases, lived kind of parallel worlds in terms of what they understood was Catholicism and their traditional beliefs at the same time. And one of my colleagues, John Diedler, who works for SWCA in Pasadena, they recently did major excavations at Mission San Gabriel and found a morning ceremony feature at Mission San Gabriel, kind of set off, maybe hidden away just a bit from the Padres, but clearly, traditional ritual activity was going on at the missions. So we're going to look again at Rancho Los Quintos. Again, it's on the west side of LA. This really would have been the hinterland for many years. Pueblo, Los Angeles, and the Mission were probably a day's walk at least from this part of the Bayona. And recruitment for this area didn't start until 20 years after Mission San Gabriel was established. So clearly, there's concentric rings of influence, and Gwasped was on the outer edge of some of those rings. So there were two archaeological sites of many in this area that we excavated, LAN 62 and LAN 211. And I'm going to start briefly talking about LAN 211, which is much more of a, in a sense, a domestic context. We don't really find a lot of habitation at either of these sites during the mission period, but clearly there's a lot of domestic activity going on. And this is one of the main features found at LAN 211. It's a linear series of these hearths, of these fire pits that were used for cooking. And we believe, based on the sheer massive amounts of artifacts that are found here associated with food, that there was feasting going on, that there was ritual feasting going on, most likely associated with what the Padres call fiestas. During certain times of year, neophytes, baptized Native Americans would be allowed to leave the mission and go back to their home villages if they were still around. And many times that was during the summer, which was a drought time of year. And so Native Americans were leaving the missions and going back and likely utilizing more traditional resources as opposed to growing crops like wheat, barley, corn, and so forth. And just to give, so you can see some examples of some of the artifacts and features. And there's some pestles and mortars and stuff that were clearly, most likely probably placed in little pits and buried. Folks were to come back and they never did to use them. And lots of fish bone, very large fish, large sea bass, a variety of other kinds of things, pelagic fish. Down in the bottom right, you can see this is just one of the wet screen trays from one of the proveniences. You can see a wide variety of artifacts, stone tools, bits of shell, animal bone, a shell bead, a cottonwood projectile point, some Monterey chert, a whole bunch of wide variety of different kinds of things. But just to give you a sense of the density of the excavations at this site, normally when we sort a provenience, a 10 centimeter by 1 by 1 provenience, it takes our folks about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours. That's what we budget. At LAN 211, it took between 18 and 21 hours to sort the provenience. So that gives you just a little bit of the sense of just how dense this stuff was. And so we really do think that that was associated with feasting activity, most likely associated with what I'm going to talk about next, at LAN 62. At LAN 62, we were out there with about 130 people for about a year, back in 2003, 2004. Massive excavations. The developer was putting in big, essentially a super fancy storm drain or drainage ditch for all of the storm water from this development, also coming off the bluffs. And we found portions of a Native American archaeological site, including a burial ground, right smack in the middle of it. You couldn't have, from a developer point of view or from a Native American point of view today, in a worse place than where it was. So this is a reconstruction of what the burial area may have looked like during the mission period. And right outside of this mission period burial area, we found some mortuary, some mourning features. Very similar to what I showed you before from West Bluffs from 2,000 years ago. These were much smaller in size, but you can see very similar sorts of things, purposeful breaking of artifacts. And again, I think what's going on is people are coming back yearly, remembering your ancestors. Your community is shrinking, right? People every single year moving to the missions, they're dying off from disease. And so more and more what you're talking about is in face-to-face interaction daily, but what you might call the imagined community. People coming from much further apart, coming to one central area to remember your ancestors and really connect with those community members that are still there. So here's just some other examples. We found a number of these pits. Some of them were filled with burned basketry, glass beads, lots of shell beads. Here's some more burned basketry on the left, cordage associated with fish nets, and massive amounts of burned seeds. Some of these baskets clearly, had just incredible amounts of seeds that were being burned in a ritual way as an offering to the ancestors and those that had passed. And so that's the archaeology of part of Guaspet. And now let's think about what I was saying before in terms of some of my frustrations working in the American Southwest about thinking about this concept of the imagined community. How can we actually put a name or a place or something to some of these people that may have been part of that larger group coming together? And mission records, baptismal records, are the way that we've thought about this. So this is just one example from reconstruction of families from the village of Guaspet. And you can see up at the top, male and female, left and right, Cristobal and Cristobala. Cristobal was actually the Capitan, or chief, of Guaspet. He was part of that last group of that spike. If you go back in 1805, the last of those 3 years of spikes. Well, after that point, I think that even though the village continued, there was a lot less recruitment, and I think it says a lot when the Capitan, or chief, for that village gets baptized. So you can actually see, this is pretty interesting. So you see that they had a number of kids. Some of them, their origin, so you have the name, the origin, and the year that they were baptized. By origin, that's in the baptismal records, and they wrote down what village you were from, or where you were born. And so a number of their children were actually born at the mission. But several of their kids, Perfecto and Cristobal, and those are Spanish names, right? In some cases we know their Native American name, that's written down as well, but in many cases the Padres just wrote down their new Christian name. So you can actually see in some cases some of their kids were born at Guaspet before they were baptized. And their parents clearly had kids. They were together before they went to the mission because they had kids that were from Guaspet. And Cristobal's wife, isn't from Guaspet. Pimu is Santa Catalina Island off the coast of California. And one of the things that John Johnson and Chester King and a number of other scholars identified back in the late 90s was that the village of Guaspet, the community of Guaspet, had the most connections to Santa Catalina Island, or Pimu, of any Gabrielino village that was recorded. So this says something, I think, about the imagined community. We're starting to see some connections between different communities based on these family ties and who people are married, people that are married at the mission, but clearly they were together and had kids before they went to the mission. You can understand some of those connections. Once people went to the mission and got married, all bets were off because it turned into this huge melting pot of very dispersed groups of people, some of them speaking very different languages, who really wouldn't have interacted that much together, getting together at the mission and creating novel, new relationships that you didn't see prior to the mission period. Oh, and Jayabit is another community that we might think about. So here's another family, Jose Maria and Josefa de Jesus. Again, Jose Maria is from Guashna, which is a derivative of the same name as Guaspet. There's probably 6 or 8 different names in the mission records. Different padres wrote down a very slight derivation, and sometimes the words would mean either a place or I'm from that place, depending on the ending of the word, like pet versus na. So here again, you can see this relationship of Guaspet or Guasna and Pimuabet, or Isla. Isla in Spanish means island. And again, down here, 2 of their kids are from Guaspet, and 2 of their kids are from Pimu, or derivative names of Mungva. And again, so this is clearly showing families are connecting between the mainland and the islands, and they're going back and forth, right? Some of the kids are being born in one village, and some kids are being born in another. So clearly they're going back and forth. And then here's just one last example. Roque had a bit of a hard time. He got married 3 times. Sequentially, his wives would die. But it's kind of interesting that two of his wives were actually from Yabit, the village adjacent to the Pueblo of Los Angeles. And in one case, it looks like they were married, or they were together and had a child before they officially got married in the Catholic Church. And so again, you're seeing these connections between different villages. And so I've just circled some of the, four of the different villages. Some of the villages we don't really know where they were, but they're somewhere in the Los Angeles area. And there's lots of other villages that I'm not showing tonight that are far-flung. Some of them are actually from Chumash territory. And one of the interesting things about Malibu, or Malibu, it was right on the boundary between Chumash and Gabrielino territory. And we know from ethnohistoric records there were actually two capitans, or two chiefs. One was Chumash and one was Gabrielino. And the Gabrielino capitan was actually from Pimu, from Santa Catalina Island. So we're seeing a lot of these connections. And so I think really here, you can really start to understand something about community. People coming together, most likely, going to Guasped once a year during the mission period, performing these different ceremonies. The community is shrinking year after year. But at the same time, there still are these very strong connections. And unlike studying, some group like the Anasazi, where you may get a sense of this imagined or reimagined community, you can actually put some places. You can actually connect the dots between people and places, I think, much more strongly here. So some of the main points. Clearly, the morning ritual, the morning ceremony got its start in Gabrielino culture 2,500 years ago, and it continued on into the mission period. And this ritual performance created community by creating that sense of belonging that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. And it really was a social and physical manifestation of community. It clearly, it wasn't just community in the sense of, the board, Archist board is a community in a sense, or some friends of mine that are here tonight that I do CrossFit with, we're a community. But this is something much more than that. This is the physical manifestation or the result of that. And it could help ease some of these tensions through ritualized communication as you're drawing people together. Clearly there's stress, there's so much crazy stuff going on during the mission period. And it was also a way to reinforce cohesion and social memory at the same time as identity. And finally, I think this is an important thing, and I was talking to Nicole Mathewitz at dinner beforehand, and she made the point that California, unlike a lot of other places in the colonial world, really hasn't made in terms of making this connection between the archaeology and the archival or ethnohistoric documents. Because we really can see this a lot better. And in California, there's something called the Early California Population Project, which is an online database, which is a database in which you can actually have access to all the digitized records from all the missions in California. So for somebody like me who just plays an ethnohistorian on TV, it's super helpful. So in the end, like I said at the beginning, major funding for a lot of this research came from the Playa Vista Archaeological and Historical Project, from Playa Capital Company, LLC. And while the central points are ours, so many creative people over the last 25 years as part of the Playa Vista Project really laid the foundation for us to be able to talk about some of this stuff today. And I feel like I have a pretty good relationship with some of the Native Americans who've been part of the project for a long time, including Cindy Alvitre and Robert Dorme, and conversations with them has really helped me think about some of these ideas, going back to West Plus 15 years ago. And a number of folks, including some folks here in the room tonight, along the way have helped me think about community. And finally, there's some flyers up here. You can get free stuff. The Playa Vista project, all 5 of the volumes are now final and complete. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Native Americans, all the different regulatory bodies have signed off on it. Our peer reviewers loved it, had constructive criticism along the way. But if you go to SRI Press, and there's a flyer here about it with the website and everything, you can download for free all 5 of those articles and learn more about some of the stuff I've talked about tonight and a lot more. And another book that recently came out about the Colonial experience, this time in New Mexico and here in Southern Arizona. Billy Graves and I, this just came out a couple of months ago, and a number of members of the society are contributors to that book. And if you go to University Press Colorado, they got a $15,000 grant to make it open access, as well as if you would like a hard copy, you can pay $85. So there's a flyer there about that as well, and the website where you can download it for free. So that's what I got. Are there any questions? Yeah.
You went, at the beginning, you went through fairly quickly some comments that things changed very quickly when the Europeans came.
Right.
Domestic animals destroyed the environment that these people knew for thousands of years. And then it seems from the fact that the land incorporated land that the Native American villages occupied.
Yeah.
What do we know about the reaction of the people to these changes?
To the Native Americans?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's actually pretty interesting. You know, a lot of scholars for a long time have really hearkened on this destruction of the traditional landscape as one of the catalysts for folks moving to the missions. But from the archaeological work we've done in the Bayona in West LA, it's actually pretty interesting. A lot of these morning ceremony features, which probably date to maybe the 1810s, somewhere in the early 1800s. There's massive amounts of indigenous foods being offered in these ceremonial features. And so it's pretty clear that certain areas, I think probably closer to the Pueblo and closer to the mission early on, got a lot more of that destruction. And some areas like the Bayona was known as a paraje or a pasture for cattle and stuff, but I don't think it was intensely used as such until probably once the Rancho Los Quintos showed up in 1804. There's very good evidence that there were literally tens of thousands of these domesticated animals around Los Angeles, to the point where in the early 1800s, there were a number of these cycles of these matanzas, these slaughterings of horses, where literally thousands upon thousands of horses would be slaughtered because it would be a drought cycle and there wouldn't be enough pasture and all the animals were dying. So I think in terms of the reaction of these Native Americans to that, I think that in some cases they went to the missions, in some cases they tried to hold on as best they could to traditional ways of life, living in many times within the confines of ranchos, or as people like Julie Bernard and some of her colleagues have written about, folks moved to refuge areas. The Central Valley, the Southern Central Valley, near the Tehachapi's, areas called Tule. So this was a big marshy area where tules grew. And that was a refuge area. That's something Julie has spent many years working on. And she actually has a chapter in this book that Kathleen and I are editing, looking specifically at these refuge communities. So as people, they got pushed further and further out and, became, in many cases, kind of hybridized communities, because you have a number of different groups from different, cultural traditions coming together. Yeah?
John, I know that your program wasn't specific on the morning ceremony, but it seems to be quite a widespread ceremony, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Do you have any thoughts on the derivation? If it was that broad, it must have been more of a focal point.
Yeah, well, I do think that our work at West Bluffs and also along Alameda Corridor, we published an American Antiquity about it a few years ago. That seems to be some of the earliest archaeological evidence of the morning ceremony from about 2,200 years ago. But you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of desert communities in Southern California, the Cahuilla, the Serrano, going up into the Central Valley, going towards the river. A lot of those groups, even in the late 19th and early 20th century, were performing the morning ceremony. And folks like Ruth Benedict published in American Antiquity back in the 05s or the teens, documenting some of these. So it is a very widespread tradition.
But it must have started someplace, I mean,
I think it
spread
started.
out
I think it started in Southern California. Some people have argued it may have had slightly longer traditions dating back to about 3,500 years ago when the Tokek speakers came into Southern California. There's massive changes from shell beads to stone beads and a variety of other desert kinds of traits. I don't know. It's a little bit hard to say. Yeah.
Did the Native Americans in California where you studied,
Yeah.
did they have a written language before the colonists
No.
and Spanish came?
No, no written language. No. So the Spanish, when they came in, through these ethno-historic documents, you can really learn a lot about the native groups that way. But it's really interesting. I mean, something I didn't talk about: ceramics. During the mission period, ceramics. In a sense, it's not a written language, but it's something permanent. It was passed down from generation to generation, and really was emblematic of a lot of the traditional knowledge that would have been passed down. And it's actually pretty interesting. In Mission St. Gabriel, their SWCA, when they did their recent excavations, were really able to identify the difference between native-made ceramics and mission-made ceramics. Even though they're both similar forms, they're made in different ways, and you can identify a lot of very different attributes. So while there was no written language, I would argue that there's a lot of these different physical traditions that you can identify and can see, a lot of these traditions through. Any other questions? Yeah.
Since there wasn't a written language, they probably passed their stories.
Yeah, so certainly there would have been oral traditions for sure.
Are there any survivors who have any of that oral tradition?
Well, yeah, I mean, during the early 20th century, folks like Huntington and a number of other ethnographers from Smithsonian, a number of other major East Coast institutions went around, and their entire job was to collect these oral traditions, these traditional stories, and write them down. And a lot of those are in the last 20 years have really started to be rediscovered. The Harrington notes especially are extremely difficult if you don't know what you're doing to interpret. And there's a pretty famous book on the Gabrielino that came out about 20 years ago now. That author looked very strongly at the Harrington notes to really come up with something about different traditions and so forth. But something like the morning ceremony, Boscana, who is a padre at Mission, I believe it was San Juan Capistrano, actually recorded, from his perspective, morning ceremonies being performed. And so that's another way, besides these later ethnographers from the early 20th century, late 19th. During the mission period, there are documents describing those in detail as well.